The phone rang at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in November, interrupting the profound silence that had become my constant companion since Devon's death 5 years ago. I almost didn't answer. Telemarketing calls had become increasingly aggressive lately, and at 60, I had little patience for strangers trying to sell me things I didn't need. Hello? Hello, ma'am. I'm calling about your health insurance plan. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the kitchen floor. The voice. God, the voice was exactly the same. Sweet, with that slight musical quality that had always reminded me of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The same voice that used to call Mom from the front hallway when she came home from school. The same voice that had argued with me about curfews and homework and whether she was old enough to wear makeup to the school dance. The same voice that had been silenced forever on October 14, 2003, in a car accident on a lonely stretch of Canadian highway. Ma'am? Are you still there? The voice asked, and I felt my legs give way as I sank into the kitchen chair where I'd been sitting when Jalen Reed called me 22 years ago to tell me that my 16-year-old daughter Leah was dead. I scrambled to pick up the phone, my hands shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip. Who is this? I whispered. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm calling from Premium Health Services about updating your insurance coverage. Is this a bad time? No, I mean... What's your name? Your real name. A pause. My name is Molly Reed. Ma'am, are you feeling all right? You sound upset. Reed. The same last name as Jalen Reed, my former neighbor and closest friend who had taken my daughter on that fatal trip to Canada. The woman who had called me sobbing and incoherent to tell me that they'd been in a terrible accident, that Leah hadn't survived, that she was so sorry, so very sorry. When were you born? I asked, my voice barely audible. Excuse me? When is your birthday? Ma'am, I'm not sure why you're asking personal questions, but March 18th, 1987, why do you want to know? The kitchen tilted around me. March 18th, 1987, the exact date my Leah was born. The date I'd celebrated every year for 16 years and then mourned every year for 22 years since. Where are you calling from? A call center in Toronto, Canada. Ma'am, you're making me a little uncomfortable. I'm just trying to discuss health insurance options. Molly, I said, testing the name on my tongue. Molly Reed. Yes, that's right. Ma'am, I think maybe I should transfer you to my supervisor. No, I said more sharply than I intended. Molly, I need to ask you something important. Do you know anything about your family? Your parents? My mother passed away 3 years ago. Why are you asking about my family? Your mother's name was Jalen Reed? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. How do you know my mother's name? I closed my eyes and saw Leah at 16, all long limbs and bright eyes and infinite possibilities stretching ahead of her. I saw her the last morning I'd seen her alive, standing in our kitchen in Cleveland wearing her favorite jeans and the sweater I'd bought her for her birthday, arguing with me about whether she really needed to pack a jacket for the trip to Canada. It's October, Mom. It's not that cold yet, she'd said, and I'd insisted she take the green wool jacket that now hung in her closet upstairs, untouched for 22 years. Molly, I think I need to see you, in person. Ma'am, I don't understand what's happening here. You're asking me very personal questions and I don't even know who you are. My name is Carol Winters. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I think you might be my daughter. The words hung in the air between us, carried across hundreds of miles of telephone lines and 22 years of grief and loss, and the kind of hope I'd taught myself never to feel again. That's impossible, Molly said quietly. My mother told me my birth parents died when I was very young. She adopted me when I was just a baby. What if she lied to you? My mother wouldn't lie about something like that. But there was uncertainty in her voice now, the first crack in whatever story she'd been told about her origins and identity. Molly, I had a daughter named Leah. She was born on March 18, 1987. She died in a car accident in Canada in 2003, when she was 16 years old. She was traveling with a woman named Jalen Reed. That's my mother's name. But she never mentioned knowing anyone from Cleveland or anything about a car accident. What did she tell you about how she got you? She said my birth parents were killed in an accident when I was very small, and that she adopted me through a private agency. She said they thought it would be better for me if I didn't know the details, because it would be too painful. I felt something breaking open in my chest, 22 years of carefully constructed grief and acceptance crumbling like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood. Molly, I need to see you. I need to know for certain. I don't understand what you think you're going to find. I'm going to find my daughter. Ma'am, Carol, I think you're confused. I'm 38 years old. I've been Molly Reed my entire life. I have birth certificates and adoption papers and school records. And I have a grave in Riverside Cemetery where I've been visiting my daughter for 22 years. But what if that grave is empty? What if the woman I trusted to take care of my child decided to keep her instead? The silence on Molly's end of the call was deafening. Where in Toronto are you? I asked. I can't tell you that. Please, just the general area. I'm going to drive there. Carol, this is crazy. You can't drive to Canada based on a phone call. I can and I will. Molly, if I'm wrong, if you're not my Leah, then I'll apologize for disturbing your life and I'll never contact you again. But if I'm right, if you're right, then everything I've believed about myself is a lie. Yes, some mothers spend decades wondering what happened to children who were taken from them by tragedy or circumstance. I was about to discover whether I'd spent 22 years mourning a daughter who was actually alive, stolen from me by the woman I'd trusted most in the world. Tomorrow, I was driving to Canada to find out if the voice on the other end of that phone call belonged to the child I'd been grieving since she was 16 years old. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen staring at the wall where Leah's high school graduation photo should have been hanging if she'd lived to graduate. Instead, there was only the faded outline where family pictures used to hang before I'd taken them down years ago because looking at them hurt too much. The drive to Toronto would take 8 hours if I left immediately, but I needed time to prepare for what might be the most important conversation of my life, or the most devastating disappointment I'd ever experienced. I called my supervisor at the clinic where I worked part-time and explained that I had a family emergency requiring immediate travel. Jennifer didn't ask questions. After 5 years of working together, she knew better than to probe into my personal life, especially anything that might involve the daughter whose death had shaped every aspect of who I'd become. Take all the time you need, Carol, and drive safely. That evening, I pulled out the box I kept hidden in my bedroom closet, the box containing everything I'd saved from Leah's 16 years of life, school photos, report cards, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, the necklace she'd been wearing the last time I saw her alive, and the police reports from the accident. I'd read them hundreds of times over the years, torturing myself with details about the crash that had taken my daughter's life on a rainy October evening in 2003. The reports stated that Jalen Reed had been driving southbound on Highway 17 near Thunder Bay when she'd lost control of her vehicle due to wet road conditions. The car had rolled 3 times before coming to rest against a stand of pine trees. Jalen had survived with a broken collarbone and concussion. Leah had been pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic head injuries, or so I'd been told. I'd never questioned the reports because I'd trusted Jalen completely. She'd been my closest friend for 8 years, my neighbor, the woman who'd helped me through Devin's long illness and recovery from his first cancer diagnosis. When she'd offered to take Leah on a weekend trip to see the fall colors in Ontario, I'd been grateful that my daughter would have a fun distraction from the stress of her father's health problems. I'd been hesitant about letting Leah travel so far with someone who wasn't family, but Jalen had been so enthusiastic about the idea, so excited to spend time with the teenager she'd always treated like the daughter she'd never been able to have. Leah needs this, Carol, Jalen had insisted. She's been so worried about Devin, and 16-year-olds shouldn't have to carry that kind of stress. Let me take her somewhere beautiful, where she can just be a kid for a few days. Now I wondered if that trip had been planned with entirely different intentions. I drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee, arriving in Toronto at dawn with no clear plan beyond finding Molly Reed and learning whether she was the daughter I'd buried in an empty casket 22 years ago. The call center where Molly worked was located in a glass office building downtown. I waited in the parking lot until 8 a.m. when employees began arriving for the morning shift, scanning faces for any resemblance to the 16-year-old girl I'd memorized during years of staring at photographs. At 8:47 a.m., I saw her. She was walking toward the building carrying a coffee and wearing a navy blue coat that brought out the color of her eyes that were exactly the same shade of green as Leah's had been. Her hair was darker now, shoulder length instead of the long blonde she'd worn as a teenager, but the bone structure of her face, the way she moved, the tilt of her head when she paused to check her phone, everything was achingly familiar. I followed her into the lobby, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid I might collapse before I could reach her. "Molly?" She turned around, and I felt the breath leave my body entirely. This wasn't just resemblance or wishful thinking. This was Leah, 22 years older, but unmistakably my daughter, standing 3 feet away from me in the lobby of a Toronto office building. "You're Carol," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." I had to. I've been thinking about our phone conversation all night. I looked up Riverside Cemetery in Cleveland online, and I found the grave you mentioned. Leah Winters, died October 14th, 2003. You found her grave? I found a grave with my supposed birth date on it. Carol, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Anything. Do you really believe I could be your daughter? Or are you a grieving mother who's become obsessed with someone who reminds you of the child you lost? The question was fair and devastating in its directness. Look at me, Molly. Really look at me. She studied my face for nearly a minute, and I watched recognition dawn in her eyes. Not memory exactly, but something deeper and more instinctive. You have my chin, she said finally, and my hands. I never knew where I got my hands from. And you have your father's eyes and his smile. You have the scar on your left knee from when you fell off your bike when you were 8 years old. Molly looked down at her leg, then back at me with growing shock. How do you know about my scar? Because I'm the one who took you to the emergency room to get the stitches. Because I'm the one who held your hand while the doctor cleaned the wound. Because I'm your mother, and I've been mourning you for 22 years while you've been alive. This is impossible. Is it? What's the earliest memory you have? I'm not sure. There are fragments, but nothing clear until I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. My mother always said that was normal, that children don't usually remember their very early years. Or maybe your mother made sure you couldn't remember your early years. What are you saying? I'm saying that Jalen Reed stole you from me, and I'm going to prove it. Some reunions happen gradually, through careful investigation and DNA testing and legal procedures that establish identity with scientific certainty. Our reunion was happening in the lobby of an office building through recognition that transcended 2 decades of separation and lies. I was looking at my daughter for the first time since she was 16 years old, and she was looking at the mother she'd been taught to believe was dead. And neither of us knew how to bridge 22 years of stolen time and fabricated truth. We sat across from each other in a small coffee shop near Molly's office building, 2 strangers connected by blood and separated by 22 years of lies. I studied every detail of her face, searching for the child I'd lost, while she struggled to process information that challenged everything she believed about her identity. Tell me about the accident, Molly said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup with the same nervous habit Leah had displayed as a teenager. Tell me exactly what happened in 2003. I closed my eyes and let myself remember that terrible October day, the day that had divided my life into before and after. It was a Friday evening. Jalen called me at home around 9 p.m. She was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. "Carol, there's been an accident. We were driving back from Algonquin Park, and the roads were so slippery from the rain." I could still hear Jalen's voice in my memory, broken and sobbing, delivering news that had shattered my world. She said the car had rolled multiple times, that the paramedics had worked for over an hour trying to save you, but that your injuries were too severe. She kept apologizing, saying it was all her fault, that she should have been more careful on the wet roads. What happened after she called you? Your father and I drove through the night to get to Thunder Bay. Devin was still weak from his cancer treatments, but nothing could have stopped him from coming to get his daughter. When we arrived at the hospital, Jalen was there with her arm in a sling and bandages on her forehead. I remembered finding Jalen in the hospital waiting room, how she'd collapsed into my arms and sobbed about losing the girl she'd loved like her own daughter. How grateful I'd been that she'd survived when my Leah hadn't. She told us that the Canadian authorities were handling the arrangements, that because of the severity of your injuries, they recommended immediate cremation rather than attempting to transport your body back to Cleveland. Cremation? Molly's voice was barely a whisper. She said it would be easier for all of us, less traumatic than seeing you in that condition. She arranged everything through the funeral home, had your ashes shipped back to Cleveland in a sealed urn, But if I was cremated, what's buried in the grave at Riverside Cemetery? An empty casket. We held a funeral service 3 days later. Half your high school came to pay their respects. Your English teacher read a poem you'd written for class. The whole thing felt surreal, like we were burying someone who was still supposed to be alive. Molly set down her coffee cup and stared out the window at the Toronto street, where people were going about their ordinary Friday morning routines, unaware that someone's entire understanding of her life was crumbling in a coffee shop booth. Molly, what's your earliest clear memory? I remember being in a hospital room. There were machines beeping and my head hurt constantly. A woman was sitting beside my bed, my mother, Jalen, and she was reading to me from a children's book. How old were you? She told me I was 6, that I'd been in an accident that affected my memory, but that she would take care of me and help me get better. I felt sick as the implications of what Jylin had done became clear. She told you that you were 6 when you were actually 16. She stole 10 years of your childhood along with your identity. But why? Why would she do something so elaborate and cruel? Because Jalen Reed had wanted a daughter her entire adult life, and infertility had made that impossible. When the accident gave her the opportunity to claim you as her own, she saw it as fate rather than theft. You're saying she let your family believe I was dead so she could keep me? I'm saying she saw a chance to have the child she'd always wanted, and she took it without caring about the destruction it would cause to everyone else. Molly pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. A woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, holding Molly's hand on what appeared to be a hospital bed. This is the woman I knew as my mother. She died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, and I held her hand while she died. Are you telling me that this woman was a kidnapper who stole me from my real family? I'm telling you that this woman was my closest friend for 8 years, someone I trusted completely, who made a decision that destroyed multiple lives so she could have what she'd always wanted most. She loved me, Carol. Whatever else she did, she raised me with genuine love and affection. She sacrificed everything to take care of me when I was recovering from my injuries. I don't doubt that she loved you, but loving someone doesn't justify stealing them from their family. Molly stood up abruptly and began pacing around our small table, her movements agitated and confused. If what you're saying is true, then my entire life has been a lie. Every birthday, every holiday, every conversation about my past, all of it was fabricated. Not fabricated, hidden. You lived those experiences, but Jalen made sure you couldn't remember the life you'd had before the accident. What was I like? Before the accident, what kind of person was I? The question broke my heart and filled it with joy simultaneously. For 22 years, I'd had no one to share memories with about Leah's personality and dreams and quirks. You were curious about everything. You wanted to be a veterinarian because you couldn't stand the idea of animals being hurt or abandoned. You played violin in the school orchestra, and you were terrible at mathematics, but excellent at writing stories. I still love animals, and I still hate math. You had a stuffed elephant named Pancakes that you'd owned since you were 3 years old. You slept with him every night until you were 13 and decided you were too old for stuffed animals. Molly's eyes filled with tears. I have dreams sometimes about a gray elephant. I never understood why. You were planning to apply to veterinary school after graduation. You'd already started researching colleges and scholarship opportunities. Instead, I've spent the last 22 years working random jobs because I could never figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I always felt like something was missing, like I was supposed to be someone else. You were supposed to be my daughter, and you still are. Some families are separated by death, distance, or divorce, and learn to build new relationships across those barriers. Our family had been separated by elaborate deception that had convinced everyone involved that separation was permanent and necessary. Now we had to figure out how to bridge 22 years of stolen time and fabricated truth. And we had to decide whether it was possible to rebuild a mother-daughter relationship between two people who were essentially strangers, connected by DNA and traumatic loss. That afternoon, Molly called in sick to work, and we drove to the apartment she'd been renting since Jalen's death 3 years ago. It was a modest one-bedroom unit in a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days, furnished with items that looked like they'd come from thrift stores and garage sales. After Mom died, I discovered she'd been living on borrowed money for years, Molly explained as she unlocked the door. The house we'd shared was mortgaged to the limit, and there were debts I knew nothing about. I had to sell everything just to cover the funeral expenses. What kind of debts? Medical bills, mostly. Her cancer treatments weren't fully covered by insurance, and she'd borrowed against the house to pay for experimental therapies. I think she spent everything she had trying to stay alive. I followed Molly into her small living room, noting how sparse and temporary everything looked, as if she'd never quite settled into the space or made it feel like home. Molly, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you have any documentation from when you were younger? Birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records? Some things. Mom kept a box of important papers in her bedroom. After she died, I brought it here, but I never really went through it carefully. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a shoebox that looked like it had been handled frequently over the years. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold as I read through them. Birth certificate for Molly Reed, born March 18, 1981, in Toronto, Ontario. Parents listed as Jalen Reed and father unknown. Adoption papers dated October 15, 2003, exactly 1 day after the car accident that had supposedly killed my daughter. Molly, look at these dates. According to this birth certificate, you were born in 1981, which would make you 22 years old when you were adopted in 2003. That can't be right. Mom always told me I was adopted as a small child. And look at this adoption paperwork. It's dated the day after the accident. Jalen filed papers to adopt you within 24 hours of the crash that supposedly killed my daughter. I found medical records that were even more disturbing. Hospital admission forms from Thunder Bay General Hospital for Molly Reed, age 16, suffering from traumatic head injury and retrograde amnesia following motor vehicle accident. Molly, these medical records show your real age at the time of the accident. 16 years old, exactly what Leah's age was in 2003. But the birth certificate says I was born in 1981. The birth certificate was forged. Jalen had money and connections, and she used them to create a false identity for you that would support her story about adopting an older child. Molly sank into her second-hand armchair, holding the medical records with shaking hands. Carol, if this is true, then I need to understand something. How could Jalen have convinced an entire hospital staff that she was my mother? How could she have fooled Canadian authorities and medical professionals? I'd been wondering the same thing, and I had a theory that made me sick to consider. Molly, when the accident happened, you were unconscious and suffering from amnesia. The hospital staff would have relied on Jalen to provide information about your identity and medical history. You think she lied to the doctors about who I was? I think she told them that you were her daughter, that you'd been traveling together when the accident occurred, and that she was your legal guardian. In a crisis situation, with you unable to speak for yourself, they would have accepted her word. But what about identification? Wouldn't they have checked ID cards or passports? I found the answer in another document from the box, a report from the Ontario Provincial Police about personal effects recovered from the accident scene. According to the report, both passengers' purses had been thrown from the vehicle during the rollover and had been too damaged by rain and debris to recover identification documents. Look at this, Molly. The police report says that all identification was destroyed in the accident. Jalen was the only person who could identify either of you to the hospital staff. So she told them I was her daughter, and they had no way to verify that information? Exactly. And by the time you regained consciousness, she'd already filed paperwork establishing herself as your legal guardian and had begun the process of creating false documentation to support her story. Molly stood up and walked to her kitchen window, staring out at the parking lot where other people were living their normal Friday afternoon lives. Carol, I need you to tell me about my father. If you're really my mother, I want to know about both of my parents. Your father's name was Devin Winters. He was an accountant who specialized in tax preparation for small businesses. He loved baseball and terrible action movies, and he made the world's best pancakes every Saturday morning. He died of cancer in 2020, the same cancer that had been in remission when you disappeared. He spent 17 years believing his daughter was dead, and then he died without ever knowing you'd survived. The grief that crossed Molly's face was immediate and devastating. I'll never meet my father? No, sweetheart, you'll never meet your father. She began crying then, deep sobs that seemed to come from 22 years of accumulated loss and confusion. I moved to comfort her, then stopped myself, uncertain whether I had the right to offer maternal comfort to someone who didn't remember being my child. Would it be okay if I hugged you? Molly nodded through her tears, and I held my daughter for the first time in 22 years. She felt different, taller, broader, shaped by experiences I hadn't shared, but something fundamental was achingly familiar. The way she leaned into comfort, the way her breathing gradually steadied as she calmed down, the way she smelled like the baby shampoo she'd always preferred. "Mom," she whispered against my shoulder, and I felt my heart break and heal simultaneously. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here now. I don't remember you, but something about this feels right, like coming home to a place I'd forgotten existed." Some mothers and daughters are separated by arguments, misunderstandings, or natural growing apart that comes with age and independence. We'd been separated by a woman who'd loved my daughter enough to steal her from everyone who'd loved her first. Now we had to figure out how to rebuild 22 years of lost relationship while grieving everything that had been taken from us. That evening, we sat on Molly's couch surrounded by photographs I'd brought from Cleveland. 22 years of family memories she'd been denied. I watched her study each image with the intense concentration of someone trying to recognize strangers who were supposed to be familiar. "This was your 16th birthday party," I said, pointing to a picture of Leah blowing out candles on a chocolate cake shaped like a violin. "You insisted on having it at home instead of going out because you wanted to invite your friend Marcus, and you were too shy to ask him to a restaurant." "Marcus?" Molly looked up from the photograph with sudden interest. "A boy from your orchestra class. You had the biggest crush on him, but you were convinced he only saw you as a friend. I have dreams sometimes about playing violin. In the dreams, there's a boy with dark hair sitting next to me, and I always wake up feeling like I've lost something important." My breath caught. "Marcus had dark hair. He played cello, and you used to practice duets together after school. Do you know what happened to him? He became a music teacher in Cleveland. He still plays with the community symphony. He spoke at your funeral, Molly. He talked about how much he'd admired your dedication and talent." She set down the photograph and covered her face with her hands. "People grieved for me. They thought I was dead, and they were sad about losing me. Your best friend Sarah cried for weeks. Your violin teacher established a scholarship in your memory. Half the school wore purple ribbons for a month because it was your favorite color. It still is my favorite color." I showed her more photographs, Christmas mornings, family vacations, ordinary moments that had seemed insignificant when they were happening, but had become precious after loss. In every picture, Leah looked happy and loved and completely secure in her place in our family. "You look so young in these photos," Molly observed, studying a picture of me braiding Leah's hair before a school concert. "I was 43 when you disappeared. Losing you aged me in ways I didn't think were possible. What was I like as a daughter? Before the accident, what was our relationship like?" I considered how to answer honestly without romanticizing our normal mother-teenage-daughter dynamics. "You were strong-willed and sometimes difficult in the way that smart 16-year-olds are difficult. You questioned everything, argued about curfews, and had very definite opinions about music and movies and social justice issues. I still have strong opinions about social justice. You also helped me take care of your father during his cancer treatments. You'd sit with him during chemotherapy sessions and read him stories or play board games to distract him from feeling sick. Tell me more about Dad. What would he have thought about finding out I was alive?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the last video I had of Devin, taken during his final hospital stay when he'd been talking about memories of Leah. He would have been overjoyed and furious at the same time. Overjoyed to discover you were alive, furious that we'd lost 17 years with you that we could never get back. In the video, Devin looked frail and tired, but his eyes lit up when he talked about teaching Leah to drive, about her terrible attempts at cooking dinner when I worked late shifts, about how proud he'd been when she'd been selected for the regional youth orchestra. He loved you completely, Molly, and he died believing that he'd failed to protect his daughter. How did you survive losing both of us? Barely. Some days I didn't want to survive. The only thing that kept me going was the belief that you and Dad would have wanted me to keep living, to find some purpose in a world that suddenly felt empty. What kind of purpose? I became a pediatric nurse. I specialized in working with children who'd been in accidents or who were facing serious illnesses. Every child I helped felt like a way of honoring your memory. Molly walked to her kitchen and returned with tea, settling back onto the couch with movements that reminded me powerfully of how Leah used to curl up in our living room chairs. "Carol, Mom, I need to ask you something that might be painful. Anything. Do you want me to move back to Cleveland?" Do you want me to try to become the daughter you lost, or do you want to get to know the person I've become over the past 22 years? The question was more complex than she probably realized. I wanted both things desperately. To recover my 16-year-old daughter and to build a relationship with the 38-year-old woman she'd become. I want to know who you are now, Molly. I want to understand how you've grown and what you've learned and what brings you joy. But I also want to share memories of who you were before, because those years were precious to me. And what about living arrangements? I don't have strong ties here in Toronto. Jalen was my only real connection to this city, and she's gone now. I'd love for you to come home to Cleveland, but only if that's what you want, not because you feel obligated to rebuild something that was taken from us. I keep thinking about my father, about how I'll never get to meet him or thank him for being a good dad during the years I can't remember. Would you like to visit his grave? Would you like to see the house where you grew up? Yes, I want to see everything. I want to understand what my life was supposed to be like. That night, Molly slept on the couch while I took her bed, both of us too emotional and overwhelmed to sleep well. I lay awake listening to her breathing and trying to process the miracle of having my daughter alive in the same room after 22 years of believing she was dead. Around 3 a.m., I heard her talking in her sleep, fragments of words that sounded like she was trying to remember something just beyond her grasp. Mom? Where are you, Mom? I went to the living room and found her having what appeared to be a nightmare, tossing restlessly and calling out for someone she couldn't quite reach. Molly, I'm here. You're safe. She woke up confused and disoriented, looking around her small apartment like she couldn't quite remember where she was. I was dreaming about a house with yellow walls and music playing somewhere. Someone was calling my name, but I couldn't find them. Your bedroom had yellow walls, and there was always music in our house because you practiced violin every afternoon. Are the walls still yellow? Yes, sweetheart. Everything is exactly the way you left it. Some mothers preserve their children's bedrooms as shrines to lost childhood. I'd preserved Leah's bedroom as a prayer that somehow, someday, she might come home to finish growing up in the room where she'd learned to dream about her future. Tomorrow, we were driving back to Cleveland so Molly could see the life that had been stolen from her, and so I could finally bring my daughter home. The drive from Toronto to Cleveland took 9 hours, during which Molly asked hundreds of questions about family traditions, neighborhood memories, and the ordinary details of a life she'd been forced to forget. I found myself talking more than I had in years, sharing stories I'd kept locked away, because there'd been no one left to remember them with me. Tell me about the house, Molly said, as we crossed the border into Ohio. What did I love about living there? You had a secret hiding place in the basement, where you kept a journal and letters from friends. You loved sitting by the big window in the living room when it rained because you could watch the whole street. And you claimed the kitchen was haunted because the refrigerator made noises at night. Did I have pets? A golden retriever named Biscuit, who died when you were 14. You were heartbroken for months and insisted we bury him in the backyard under your favorite apple tree. Is the tree still there? Yes, and so is Biscuit's grave marker. Your father and I could never bring ourselves to remove it. As we drove through the familiar neighborhoods of Cleveland, I watched Molly study everything with intense concentration, searching for recognition that might never come. It feels familiar in a way I can't explain, she said, as we turned onto Maple Street. Not like memory, exactly, but like déjà vu. That's our house, I said, pulling into the driveway of the blue Colonial where Devin and I had raised our daughter for 16 years. Molly sat in the passenger seat, staring at the front porch where Leah used to practice violin on summer evenings, at the bedroom window where she'd snuck out twice during her rebellious phase, at the mailbox where she'd waited for college brochures that had never arrived. I know this place, she whispered. I can't remember it exactly, but something deep inside me recognizes it. I led her through the front door into the living room, where family photos covered every surface, pictures I'd been unable to look at for years, but had never been able to put away. Oh my God, Molly said, stopping in front of the mantelpiece where dozens of photos showed Leah at every age from infancy to 16. That's me. That's really me. She picked up a photo from her 15th birthday, studying her younger face with wonder and grief. I look so happy, so sure of myself and my place in the world. You were happy. You felt secure and loved and confident about your future. What did I want to be when I grew up? A veterinarian. You were going to specialize in treating injured wildlife, and you wanted to open a clinic that would provide free care for pets whose owners couldn't afford medical treatment. I still love animals. In Toronto, I volunteer at a shelter on weekends. I showed her through the house slowly, pointing out details that might trigger memories. The height marks on her bedroom doorframe where we'd measured her growth every birthday. The chip in the bathroom mirror from when she'd accidentally hit it with her hairbrush. The burn mark on the kitchen counter from the time she'd tried to make me breakfast in bed and had forgotten about the toaster. Can I see my room? I'd been dreading and anticipating this moment for 22 years. Leah's bedroom had remained exactly as she'd left it. Clothes in the dresser, books on the shelves, violin case on the desk chair where she'd set it down for the last time. Molly stood in the doorway for a full minute before entering, overwhelming emotions playing across her face as she took in the space that had been hers for the first 16 years of her life. The yellow walls, she said finally. I remember dreaming about yellow walls. She walked to the desk where homework assignments from October 2003 still sat in neat stacks, untouched for over 2 decades. This is my handwriting, she said, picking up an essay about Jane Eyre that had been due the week after the accident. I remember writing this. Not clearly, but there's something familiar about the words and ideas. Your English teacher said it was the best essay you'd ever written. You were so excited to get her feedback. Molly opened the closet and found clothes that had fit her at 16, now obviously too small for her adult body, but still carrying the faint scent of the perfume she'd loved. I had good taste in clothes, she said with a small smile, holding up a green sweater that had been her favorite. And apparently I liked this color even then. She sat on the bed and picked up the stuffed elephant that had been her childhood companion. Pancakes? You remember his name? I remember something. The texture of his fur, maybe. The way he smelled like fabric softener. I sat beside her on the bed where I'd read her stories every night until she'd decided she was too old for bedtime rituals. Molly, I need to tell you about the funeral, about what it was like for everyone who loved you to believe you were gone. I'm not sure I'm ready to hear about that. You need to understand what Jailin's decision cost our family and our community. You need to know how many people's lives were damaged by her choice to steal you instead of telling the truth about the accident. I told her about the hundreds of people who'd attended her funeral, about the scholarship fund her school had established, about the way her father had never quite recovered from the guilt of not being able to protect his daughter. Your disappearance didn't just affect me and Dad. It affected your teachers, your friends, your orchestra director, your best friend's family. Everyone who'd been part of your life felt responsible for not somehow preventing what they thought was your death. Sarah. You mentioned my best friend Sarah. Sarah Peterson. She lives about 10 minutes away now. She's married with 3 children, and she still visits your grave every year on the anniversary of the accident. Does she know I'm alive? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first about how we handle telling people about your return. What do you mean? Molly, your reappearance is going to be news. A girl who died in a tragic accident 22 years ago turning out to be alive and stolen by a family friend? The media will be interested in that story. I hadn't thought about publicity. We need to decide whether we want to control the narrative by talking to reporters ourselves, or whether we want to try to keep it private while we rebuild our relationship. What do you think we should do? I think we should focus on each other first. Everything else can wait. That evening, I cooked dinner in the kitchen where Leah and I had prepared hundreds of meals together, while Molly explored the house and reacquainted herself with spaces that held fragments of memories she couldn't quite reach. Mom? She called from the living room, using the title that still felt miraculous every time she said it. Can you come here? I found her sitting at the piano, her fingers moving tentatively over keys that hadn't been played since the day she'd disappeared. I remember this song, she said, picking out the melody to a piece she'd been learning before the accident. My fingers remember it even though my mind doesn't. She played for 20 minutes, muscle memory guiding her through pieces she'd practiced as a teenager, while I sat nearby and cried at the sound of music filling our house again after 22 years of silence. Some mothers get to watch their children grow up day by day, sharing every milestone and memory as it happens. I was watching my daughter rediscover a childhood she'd been forced to forget, reclaiming pieces of herself that had been buried under decades of lies. And for the first time since 2003, our house felt like a home again, instead of a museum to loss. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Molly crying in her old bedroom. I found her sitting on the floor surrounded by journals, photo albums, and memory boxes I'd saved from her childhood. Evidence of a life she'd been prevented from remembering for 22 years. I keep reading things I wrote, looking at pictures I'm in, and it's like watching someone else's life, she said through tears. I know intellectually that this was me, but I can't feel the connection to that girl. Sweetheart, you suffered a severe head injury. The fact that you have any memories at all is remarkable. But I want to remember you, Mom. I want to remember Dad and this house and feeling safe and loved. Instead, I have 22 years of memories with a woman who stole me from my real family. I sat beside her on the floor and pulled her into my arms the way I'd done when she was small and upset about childhood disappointments. Tell me about your life with Jalen. Help me understand who you became during the years we lost. Molly leaned against me and began sharing stories about the woman who'd raised her under false pretenses, but with genuine affection. She was a good mother in many ways. She helped me through the confusion and fear of recovering from the accident. She paid for years of physical therapy and tutoring to help me relearn basic skills. She never made me feel like a burden, even when I couldn't remember how to read or write properly. What was she like as a person? Gentle and patient, but also secretive about our past. Whenever I asked about my early childhood or my biological parents, she'd change the subject or give vague answers about traumatic memories being better left alone. Did she ever seem guilty or conflicted about keeping you? Sometimes I'd catch her watching me with this sad expression, like she was remembering something painful. She'd cry sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, and she'd always get emotional around the anniversary of our accident. I felt a complicated mix of anger and sympathy for Jalen Reed. She'd destroyed our family through her selfish actions, but she'd also provided my daughter with love and care during years when I'd believed Leah was dead. Molly, what was your life like after Jalen died? How have you been supporting yourself? It's been difficult. I discovered that everything I thought I knew about our financial situation was wrong. The house, the cars, even some of the furniture were all purchased with borrowed money. After the funeral expenses and debt payments, I was left with almost nothing. Is that why you're working at a call center? It's one of the few jobs I could find that didn't require extensive background checks or education verification. My adoption papers and school records were incomplete. I realized that Jalen's criminal fraud had created ongoing legal complications for Molly, even after her death. What kind of problems with your documentation? Some of my educational transcripts were missing, and my social security number had inconsistencies that made employment verification difficult. I always assumed it was bureaucratic confusion, but now I understand it was probably related to forged identity documents. Molly, we'll need to work with lawyers to establish your real legal identity and sort out the documentation issues. What happens to the name Molly Reed? I've been answering to that name for 22 years. It feels like part of who I am now. You can use whatever name feels right to you. Legally, you're Leah Winters, but emotionally, you might want to honor both identities. That afternoon, I called Sarah Peterson and asked her to come over for an important conversation. When she arrived at our house, I met her at the front door and tried to prepare her for news that would challenge everything she'd believed for over 2 decades. Carol, you sounded strange on the phone. Is everything all right? Sarah, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to be shocking and difficult to believe. I led her into the living room where Molly was waiting nervously, unsure how to handle reunions with people who'd mourned her supposed death. Sarah looked at Molly for several seconds before recognition dawned in her eyes. Oh my God. Leah? Hello, Sarah. Sarah began crying immediately, covering her mouth with both hands as she processed the impossibility of seeing her best friend alive after 22 years of believing she was dead. How is this possible? We buried you. I spoke at your funeral. For the next 2 hours, we explained the whole story. The accident, Jalen's deception, the forged documents, the 22 years of stolen time. Sarah listened with growing horror and amazement. Jalen Reed stole you? The woman who comforted us at your funeral? Who helped carry your casket? Who established the memorial scholarship in your name? The same woman, I confirmed. She grieved publicly while privately raising the daughter she'd taken from us. Leah? Molly? Do you remember anything about our friendship? About the plans we made for college and traveling together? I have fragments, dreams about a girl with red hair who laughed a lot and shared secrets with me, but nothing clear enough to call real memory. Sarah showed Molly photos on her phone, pictures of her own children, her wedding, milestones that had happened during the decades when she'd believed her best friend was dead. I named my middle daughter Leah in your honor. I've told her stories about the friend I lost in high school who would have been the best aunt in the world. You can still tell her those stories, and now you can tell her that her namesake came home. That evening, Molly and I sat on the front porch where she'd practiced violin as a teenager, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children play in yards that had remained largely unchanged since 2003. Mom, I've made a decision about moving back to Cleveland. What have you decided? I want to come home. I want to live in this house and try to rebuild the life that was stolen from both of us. Are you sure? It's a big change, leaving everything you've established in Toronto. Everything I had in Toronto was built on lies. This place, these relationships, this family, it's the first thing that's felt real to me since Jalen died. What about your job? Your apartment? I'll give notice at the call center and break my lease. None of that was permanent anyway. I've been drifting for 3 years, never feeling settled or connected to anything. Molly, I want you to know that having you home won't erase the 22 years we lost. We're both different people than we were when you were 16. I know, but we can build something new while honoring what we used to have. And we need to talk about legal issues, therapy to help you process the trauma of learning your whole life was based on deception and how to handle the media attention this story will probably generate. One day at a time, Mom. For now, I just want to sleep in my old room and wake up knowing that my real family is downstairs making breakfast. Some families reunite gradually after separations caused by divorce, military deployment, or other circumstances that allow for preparation and adjustment. Our family was reuniting after 22 years of believing reunion was impossible, processing grief, joy, anger, and hope simultaneously while trying to make sense of time that could never be recovered. But tonight, for the first time since 2003, both of my children would be sleeping under the same roof, one in the cemetery where I'd buried my husband 5 years ago, and one in the bedroom where she'd dreamed about her future before it was stolen from her. Tomorrow, we would begin the complicated process of rebuilding a mother-daughter relationship between strangers who shared DNA and love, but not memories. Tonight, I was just grateful that my daughter was alive and choosing to come home. 3 weeks later, I was standing in my kitchen watching Molly attempt to make the same chocolate chip cookies she'd loved baking as a teenager. Her movements were tentative and unsure, following a recipe she'd found in her old handwriting but couldn't remember creating. I keep feeling like I should know how much vanilla to add without looking at the recipe, she said, measuring carefully. My hands want to move automatically, but my brain won't let them. Muscle memory is trying to return. Your occupational therapist said that repetitive activities from before your injury might trigger recognition patterns. It's frustrating. Yesterday I couldn't remember where we kept the mixing bowls, but somehow I knew exactly which cabinet held the baking sheets. We'd spent the past 3 weeks settling Molly into her old life, updating legal documents, meeting with therapists, and slowly introducing her to people who'd known Leah before the accident. Each interaction brought new discoveries about the person she'd been versus the person she'd become. Mom, Dr. Martinez wants to schedule some sessions with both of us together. She thinks family therapy might help us process the unique trauma of reuniting after fabricated death. How do you feel about that? I think I need help understanding how to be someone's daughter when I can't remember learning to love them the first time. The observation was heartbreaking in its honesty. Molly was struggling with the emotional complexity of rebuilding a relationship with a mother she knew she'd loved but couldn't remember feeling love for. Sweetheart, you don't have to force feelings that aren't there yet. Love can be rebuilt through new experiences as well as recovered through old memories. But I want to remember loving you and Dad. I want to remember feeling safe and cherished and part of a family. You were cherished. Every day of your life, until the accident, you were completely loved and supported. The doorbell interrupted our conversation, and I found Detective Linda Rodriguez on my front porch carrying a thick file folder that I suspected contained news about the investigation into Jalen's criminal actions. Mrs. Winters, I have some updates about the legal aspects of your daughter's case. Is Molly available to hear this information? Of course. Come in. Detective Rodriguez had been working with Canadian authorities to piece together the scope of Jalen's fraud and determine whether criminal charges could be filed posthumously. Molly, We've completed our investigation into the documentation that Jalen Reed created to support her claim that you were her adopted daughter, Detective Rodriguez explained, setting the file on our kitchen table. What did you discover? Extensive criminal fraud spanning multiple jurisdictions. Jalen forged birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records, and educational transcripts. She bribed at least 3 Canadian officials to process false documentation, and she established fraudulent financial accounts to support her fabricated identity claims. How much money did she spend on creating my false identity? Molly asked. Approximately $400,000 over the course of 22 years. That's why she died in debt. She'd been paying bribes and fees to maintain the fiction that you were her legally adopted daughter. I felt sick, realizing the scope of Jalen's planning and investment in stealing my daughter. Detective Rodriguez, what happens now? Can we pursue criminal charges even though Jalen is dead? We can't prosecute her, but we can charge the officials who accepted bribes and processed fraudulent documents. More importantly, we can clear up Molly's legal status and ensure she has proper documentation going forward. What about the people who helped Jalen? Were there others involved in the conspiracy? We've identified a document forger in Toronto who created false papers for Jalen, and 2 officials at the Canadian Adoption Agency who were paid to expedite applications without proper background checks. All 3 individuals are facing criminal charges. Molly had been quiet throughout this conversation, processing information about the criminal network that had enabled her kidnapping. Detective, I need to ask about something that's been bothering me. How did Jalen manage to convince hospital staff that I was her daughter immediately after the accident? According to witness statements we've collected, Jalen told emergency responders that you were her daughter and that your identification had been destroyed in the crash. In the chaos of treating your injuries, no one questioned her claim. But what about my real identification? What happened to my wallet and documents? Detective Rodriguez opened her file and pulled out evidence photos that made my breath catch. Jalen disposed of your real identification before emergency responders arrived. We found your wallet, learner's permit, and school ID card buried near the accident site. She deliberately destroyed evidence of your true identity. So the theft was premeditated? I asked. Not initially. Our investigation suggests that Jalen made the decision opportunistically after realizing that your amnesia and the destroyed vehicle gave her a chance to claim you as her own child. How long did she have to make that decision? Based on emergency response timeline, approximately 15 minutes between the accident and the arrival of paramedics. She used that time to hide your identification and create a story that would allow her to take legal custody. Molly stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the backyard where her father's roses were beginning to bloom. 15 minutes. My entire life changed because Jalen had 15 minutes to decide she wanted to keep me more than she wanted to tell the truth. Molly, her decision was criminal and selfish, but it doesn't diminish the fact that she did love you in her own twisted way. I know she loved me. That's what makes this so complicated. For 22 years, she was the only mother I knew, and she genuinely cared for me even while she was committing ongoing fraud to keep me. Detective Rodriguez gathered her files and prepared to leave, but she had one final piece of information that would change our understanding of Jalen's motivations. Mrs. Winters, there's one more thing you should know about Jalen Reed's background. We discovered that she'd attempted to adopt children through legitimate channels multiple times over the past 30 years, but her applications were always denied. Why were they denied? Mental health issues, specifically an obsessive personality disorder that adoption agencies considered incompatible with child rearing. Jalen had been deemed psychologically unfit to adopt children, which explains why she resorted to theft when the opportunity presented itself. After Detective Rodriguez left, Molly and I sat in our living room processing information that painted Jalen as both criminal mastermind and mentally ill woman whose desire for motherhood had driven her to destroy multiple lives. Mom, I need to visit Dad's grave. I need to tell him that I'm home. We drove to Riverside Cemetery, where Devin had been buried next to the empty plot that was supposed to contain our daughter's remains. I watched Molly kneel beside her father's headstone and speak to him for the first time in 22 years. Hi, Daddy. I know you can't hear me, but I wanted you to know that I came home. I'm sorry it took so long, and I'm sorry you died thinking I was gone. Mom says you loved me completely, and I wish I could remember what that felt like. She placed flowers on Devon's grave, and then walked to the empty plot marked with Leah's name. This is strange. Looking at my own grave marker. Should we have it removed? We could change it to a memorial marker instead of a grave marker. Something that acknowledges the 22 years when we believed you were here. I like that idea. It honors the grief you and Dad experienced even though it was based on lies. Some families visit graves to remember loved ones who've died. We were visiting graves to acknowledge years of unnecessary grief while celebrating the miracle of discovering that death had been fabricated. And for the first time since finding my daughter alive, I felt like we might actually be able to rebuild our relationship on foundations stronger than shared DNA and recovered memories. We had the harder foundation of choosing each other despite the trauma we'd survived and the time we'd lost. That evening, Molly played violin for an hour, working through pieces she'd once known by heart, but now had to relearn note by note. The music wasn't perfect, but it filled our house with life again. And that was enough to begin healing 22 years of silence. 6 months after bringing Molly home, we were sitting in Dr. Martinez's office for what would be our final family therapy session. The past half year had been a journey of rediscovering each other while processing the trauma of lost time and fabricated death. Carol, how do you feel your relationship with Molly has evolved since her return? Dr. Martinez asked. It's been different than I expected. I thought reuniting would feel like getting my 16-year-old daughter back, but instead, I've been getting to know the 38-year-old woman she became. In some ways, that's been better than trying to recapture a relationship with someone who no longer exists. And Molly, how has it felt to rebuild a connection with your mother? Difficult, but healing. I can't remember loving her the first time, but I'm learning to love her now based on who she is today rather than who she was when I was 16. She's patient and kind and doesn't pressure me to be someone I can't remember being. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. You've both done remarkable work accepting that your relationship needed to be rebuilt rather than simply resumed. The hardest part, I added, has been grieving the years we lost while celebrating the miracle of having time together now. Some days I'm angry about everything Jaylin stole from us, and other days I'm just grateful that Molly survived. Molly, how do you process your complicated feelings about Jaylin? I've come to understand that she was deeply mentally ill, which explains her actions without excusing them. She loved me genuinely but selfishly, prioritizing her own need for motherhood over my right to know my real family. And how do you handle the fact that your entire childhood was built on lies, by focusing on building truth now? I can't recover authentic memories from before the accident, but I can create authentic experiences with my real family moving forward. Dr. Martinez had helped us understand that trauma recovery didn't require remembering the past perfectly. It required building healthy relationships in the present while processing grief for what had been lost. What are your plans for the future? She asked. Molly is enrolling in college to study veterinary medicine, I said proudly. At 38, she's pursuing the dream she had at 16. It feels right, Molly explained. Working with animals has always brought me peace, even during the years when I didn't understand why. Now I know it connects me to aspirations I had before my identity was stolen. And Carol, how are you adjusting to having your daughter home? I'm learning to be the mother of an adult, rather than trying to resume mothering the teenager I lost. Molly doesn't need me to protect and guide her the way I would have when she was 16. She needs me to support and love her as an independent woman building her own life. That shows remarkable emotional maturity from both of you. After our therapy session, Molly and I drove to the veterinary school at Case Western Reserve University, where she was starting classes in January. Watching her tour the facilities and speak with professors, I saw glimpses of the passionate, determined girl she'd been before the accident. Mom, I've been thinking about something, she said as we walked across campus. I want to specialize in treating animals who've suffered traumatic injuries. I feel like my experience with amnesia and recovery gives me insight into how trauma affects living beings. That sounds perfect for you. And I want to establish a foundation that provides free veterinary care for families who can't afford treatment. We could call it Leah's Legacy, honoring both my original dreams and the journey I've taken to reclaim them. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become. I wish I could remember him, but I feel his presence in this house and in the stories you tell about him. Sometimes I think I can almost hear his voice encouraging me to follow my dreams. That evening, Sarah Peterson came over for dinner with her 3 children, including her middle daughter Leah, who was now 12 years old and fascinated by meeting her namesake. "Aunt Molly," young Leah said, "Mom told me you lost your memory in an accident. Do you remember being friends with her when you were kids?" "I don't have clear memories, sweetheart, but I feel connected to your mom in a way that's deeper than memory. Sometimes love transcends what we can remember." "Will your memory ever come back completely?" "Probably not, but that's okay. I'm making new memories now with people who are important to me." Sarah's children called Molly Aunt Molly naturally, treating her return as a wonderful family expansion rather than a traumatic disruption. Their acceptance had helped both Sarah and Molly rebuild their friendship based on who they were now rather than who they'd been 22 years ago. "Molly, do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if the accident hadn't happened?" Sarah asked as we cleaned up after dinner. "All the time. I probably would have gone to college immediately, become a veterinarian in my 20s, maybe gotten married and had children by now. But dwelling on alternate realities isn't productive." "Do you feel like you missed out on important life experiences?" "I missed out on experiencing them with my real family, but I didn't miss out on living. The past 22 years weren't wasted even though they were built on lies. I learned things and grew in ways that might not have happened if my life had followed its original path. That's a remarkably healthy perspective." "Therapy helps," Molly laughed, "and having a mother who supports me rebuilding my life, rather than trying to recapture my childhood." Later that night, I found Molly in the backyard sitting beside Biscuit's grave marker, something she did frequently when she needed quiet time to think. "What you thinking about out here?" "About how strange it is to grieve for a dog I can't remember loving, while feeling sad that he died without knowing I was alive. Biscuit loved you completely. You were his favorite person in the whole world. I've been thinking about getting another dog. Not to replace him, but to honor the connection I apparently had with animals, even as a child. I think that's a wonderful idea." "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Anything. Do you ever wonder if you would have been happier if you'd somehow moved on from grieving for me? If you'd remarried or built a different life instead of keeping my room unchanged for 22 years? The question was profound and painful in its thoughtfulness. "Molly, I don't regret preserving your memory or maintaining hope that someday you'd come home. The life I built while grieving for you led me to become a pediatric nurse, which gave meaning to my existence even when everything felt empty. But you were alone for so many years. I was alone, but not without purpose. And now you're home, which makes every year of waiting worthwhile, even if I can't remember being your little girl. Especially because you chose to be my daughter again, without the benefit of childhood memories. That choice means more to me than any recovered recollection could." Some mothers and daughters reconnect through shared nostalgia about childhood experiences and family traditions. We'd reconnected by building new traditions while honoring the love that had survived 22 years of separation and lies. And tomorrow, we would wake up in the same house where Leah had dreamed about her future before it was stolen, and where Molly was now planning a future that honored both who she'd been and who she'd become. That was more than enough to begin the rest of our lives together. 2 years later, I was standing in the backyard of our Cleveland home, watching Molly graduate from her veterinary program with highest honors. The ceremony was being held outdoors due to COVID restrictions, but nothing could diminish the pride I felt watching my daughter achieve the dream she'd held since she was 16 years old. "Dr. Molly Winters," the dean announced, and my heart swelled as she walked across the makeshift stage to receive her diploma. She'd chosen to reclaim her original name legally while keeping Molly as her preferred first name, a decision that honored both her stolen identity and her recovered heritage. To friends and colleagues, she was Dr. Molly Winters, but at home, she was simply my daughter who'd found her way back to dreams that had survived 24 years of trauma and deception. "Mom, I did it," she said, running to embrace me after the ceremony concluded. "I'm finally going to be the veterinarian I always wanted to be. Your father would be so proud. He always believed you'd accomplish whatever you set your mind to. I feel like he's been watching over this whole journey. Sometimes when I'm studying late at night, I swear I can sense his presence encouraging me to keep going." Sarah Peterson and her family had driven up from Columbus for the graduation, along with several other friends who'd been part of Leah's original circle, and had embraced Molly's return with joy and support. "Speech! Speech!" called Marcus Thompson, Leah's former orchestra partner, who was now a successful music teacher and had become one of Molly's closest friends during her readjustment to Cleveland. "I'm not giving a speech," Molly laughed, But I will say that this degree represents more than just academic achievement. It represents reclaiming a future that was stolen from me and building something meaningful on foundations of truth instead of lies. And what's next for Dr. Molly Winters? Asked young Leah Peterson, now 14, and one of Molly's most devoted admirers. Next month, I'm opening Leah's Legacy Veterinary Clinic in partnership with the Cleveland Animal Shelter. We'll provide free medical care for pets whose families can't afford treatment, and we'll specialize in trauma recovery for animals who've been injured or abused. That sounds perfect for someone who understands recovery from trauma, Sarah observed. Animals don't lie about their pain or pretend to be something they're not. Working with them feels honest in ways that remind me why I love them, even when I couldn't remember loving anything else. That evening, after the celebration ended and our guests had gone home, Molly and I sat on the front porch where she'd practiced violin as a teenager and where she now often studied veterinary texts in the evening. Mom, there's something I want to tell you that I've been thinking about for months. What is it, sweetheart? I've been having dreams lately that feel like recovered memories, not clear recollections, but emotional impressions of feeling safe and loved and part of a family. What kind of impressions? The sense of coming home from school and knowing someone would be there who cared about my day. The feeling of being tucked into bed by parents who made me feel precious and protected. The knowledge that I belonged somewhere unconditionally. I felt tears welling up as she described fragments of the childhood love she'd been denied the chance to remember. Do you think those feelings are real memories or wishful thinking? I think they're real. Not specific events, but the emotional foundation that you and Dad created during my first 16 years. That foundation survived the amnesia and the deception and all the years of lies. How does it feel to sense those memories returning? Like coming home to myself. For 24 years, I felt like something essential was missing from my identity. Now I understand it was the security of knowing I'd been completely loved before the world taught me to doubt my worth. You were completely loved. Every day of your life until the accident, you were the center of our universe. I believe that now, not just intellectually but emotionally. And Mom, I want you to know that I love you now just as deeply as I apparently loved you then. How can you be sure? Because loving you feels natural and right and effortless. When I choose to trust you, to confide in you, to build my future around our relationship, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like coming home. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the sounds of our neighborhood in the evening, dogs barking, children playing, normal life continuing around us as it had for the past 2 years since Molly's return. Mom, I need to tell you about a decision I've made regarding the clinic. What decision? I want to establish a memorial wall for Dad in the waiting room, with information about his life and his love for animals and family. I can't remember him, but I want other families to know about the man who would have been proud to see his daughter healing injured animals. Molly, that's a beautiful way to honor his memory. And I want to include Biscuit's photo too, because he was apparently my first patient and the reason I fell in love with animal care. He would love being remembered that way. There's one more thing. I've been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wants to tell our story. They think it could help other families dealing with missing children or false death notifications. How do you feel about that level of publicity? I think our story might give hope to other families who've lost children, and it might help expose the kind of criminal fraud that Jalen committed so that other people don't become victims. Are you ready to discuss Jalen publicly? I think I am. I've come to understand that she was both my kidnapper and the woman who raised me with love during years when you thought I was dead. Both things can be true simultaneously. That's a very mature perspective. Therapy and time have helped me process the complexity of what happened to our family. 6 months later, the documentary Stolen Daughter: The Leah Winters Story premiered at the Cleveland International Film Festival. Watching our family's trauma and recovery presented on screen was emotional and cathartic, and the film went on to win awards for bringing attention to issues of false death certification and adoption fraud. A telemarketing call came through with a voice identical to my daughter Leah, who died in a car accident in Canada when she was 16. When I asked her name, she said Molly Reed, my former neighbor's last name. When I asked her birthday, she gave me Leah's exact birth date. I drove to Canada and discovered that my daughter hadn't died in 2003. My neighbor Jalen had taken advantage of Leah's amnesia to steal her identity, forge adoption papers, and raise my daughter as her own while I grieved for 22 years. That phone call didn't just solve a mystery. It brought my daughter home and proved that sometimes the impossible is just the truth waiting to be discovered. Now, at 62, I was no longer Carol Winters, the grieving mother who'd spent decades visiting an empty grave and keeping a shrine to her dead daughter. I was Carol Winters, mother of Dr. Molly Winters, who'd survived the theft of her child and lived to see her daughter reclaim the dreams that had been interrupted but never destroyed. Some families are separated by death, distance, or circumstances beyond their control. Our family had been separated by criminal deception, but reunited by the miracle of a voice on a telephone that sounded exactly like the daughter I'd never stopped loving. And every evening, when Molly came home from her veterinary clinic where she healed animals who'd suffered trauma, we sat together in the house where she'd first learned to dream about helping creatures who couldn't help themselves. The little girl who'd wanted to save injured animals had grown into a woman who did exactly that, despite losing 22 years to lies and false identities. Love, it turned out, was stronger than amnesia, fraud, and even the devastating grief of parents who'd buried an empty casket. And some daughters find their way home not through recovered memories, but through voices that carry the heart of who they've always been, calling across decades of separation to the mothers who never stopped listening for their return. The end.